Hello everybody, this is Glenn Maurer and I'm here today to do another episode of The Next Step, TVSB, a show that you can watch on Cable 17 in the local Santa Barbara area, or you can catch on Ustream or YouTube by Googling The Next Step TVSB, and either of those sources will get this program if you're interested in watching it again, or the other programs we've done over the last several years. Quite a few by now, and some of them are interesting. In fact, one of the programs we did in the past, a few months ago, was on the subject we're going to address again today. And that show we had David Krieger from the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and he and I discussed Iran and the nuclear negotiations, or the negotiations that were going on at the time to create an agreement to allow divestiture of nuclear technology by Iran, and the lifting of the sanctions that had been imposed upon Iran by the Western powers. And we brought it sort of up to date about what was happening. Since that time, of course, a framework agreement has now been gone over, and a treaty has been proposed in which Iran and the West, 5+1 members of the West, would move on and maybe normalize relationships. To bring this up to date and see what is the status of that and what's the future hold, we've got two great guests here. One is Dr. Farzin Nasir, who is an eminent scholar of economics, global international studies. He's taught courses in global studies, international political economy, international relations, comparative politics, and on, and at the New School for Social Research, the New York Institute of Technology, the University of California, Santa Barbara, Westmont College, Golden Gate University, and currently he's a professor at Ventura College. Our other guest is Hap Ziegler, who's been on before to discuss some of these shows. Hap is an attorney and a consultant and an observer. And I'd say that Hap, I always like to identify you as being an activist in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which I think is important for this kind of conversation. And what we're going to try to do is talk between the three of us about where this negotiation has come to, what the international aspects of it might be, and what the domestic U.S. political aspects of it might be, and what the future would hold. I will start off by saying straight out, I am strongly in favor of the ratification of this treaty. So President Obama says his Secretary of State overseas, and with other international leaders, they negotiate a treaty which is now going to go before the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Congress has something like 60 days to object to this treaty. Is that correct, gentlemen?
That's our understanding.
In order to do so, they not only have obtained enough votes to object to a closure vote, which was 60 votes, plus they'd also have to get enough votes to override on almost certain presidential veto of any rejection of this any rejection of the treaty, which the president, let's get that straight, the president has negotiated a treaty which will go into effect unless Congress blocks it.
Right. It's default that it will happen unless Congress acts.
And so the only way they can do this is to have more than 2/3 probably on 2 occasions to get it to, so.
Almost for sure. If they get 2/3 the first time, he's going to veto it. So
and they have to do it again.
They have to do it again. Right.
Okay, so let's talk about what this pact, we've heard so many scare things about what this, how the weakness of it is and everything, but what Dr. Nasri, I'm sorry, I started with that N back in there. Nasri, tell us what this essence is of what the West has gotten in this treaty.
Well, basically, I think it's better for us to start with the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and see where Iran is coming from.
We have a map of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so while you're talking, we're going to try to get that up on the screen.
The treaty provides for a number of requirements. One of them is that, and by the way, remember that this treaty is a voluntary treaty.
Now, let me stop for a moment. We do have it on the screen, and it's interesting to look at because there's a map of the world. The green green states are the states that have signed and ratified the treaty. The red states are the non-signatory states, which are Israel, Pakistan, and India, all American allies, I might point out.
North Korea at this point.
And North Korea is withdrawn, was a signatory and was withdrawn. So it's sort of interesting. Okay, going back, so the whole world is basically a participant in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, including Iran.
Yeah. And it is a voluntary agreement as demonstrated by North Korea. And you enter into a voluntary agreement because the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So Pakistan and Israel and India did not venture to become members. What are the advantages? This is something that is lost to some of the discussion that we have. That if you do not have nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, you're entitled to it. The other countries...
I want to make that clear.
Yeah,
under the NNP, every nation who agrees to be bound by the principles of that treaty
precisely
are allowed to produce nuclear
technology for peaceful purposes. And so Russia has been going along based on the terms of that agreement. And the idea that they shouldn't is actually a violation of the term of that agreement. Otherwise, why should Iran become a member? So that's one part of it. The second thing is that if you do not have nuclear weapons technology, then you should not acquire it. And if you do have nuclear weapons technology, then you should not provide it. The fourth one, which nobody talks about, is that if you do have nuclear weapons, and that's another sweetener of the deal for countries to become members to this treaty, is that if you do have nuclear weapons, you have to enter into serious negotiations in a reasonable amount of time to get rid of the nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, the United States right now, as you know, is being sued. The United States and the 8 other nuclear powers are being sued by Marshall Islands in the International Court of Justice on that very point. And again, they're also suing the United States government in the domestic federal courts.
Let's get back to Iran.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that Iran has a nuclear weapon or is specifically working toward a nuclear weapon?
This is something which is a very difficult thing to say because it's hearsay. Nobody has any kind of documentation having gone into those facilities to come to that agreement. But on that question, it's important to note that the way we interpret the treaty can give us different answers to that question. So is research on nuclear technology, nuclear weapons technology, a violation of the terms of the agreements of NPT? According to the letter which was written by 19 scientists recently, that wasn't. And now we actually have it, which is not in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but now even research on the weapons, not just the construction, research of it is going to be limited. So
When you say going to be, it's not part of the agreement today.
yes, it is part of the agreement today.
And when did that get agreement by all the countries we put up on the screen?
Well, this is the agreement which was made by, this is part of the executive agreement which we have, which was signed by the United States and it was approved by the Security Council and by the other members.
I see.
So in this deal, which is not a treaty, they came up, they made it an executive agreement
I see.
to avoid some problems there.
But I'm not trying to be
So
too...
just to clarify the last point, did Iran go along with that executive
Iran went
agreement?
along with that. So right now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does not allow you to develop nuclear weapons technology, but it doesn't say that it cannot research on it.
But that was the new executive.
No, the actual NPT, but the new agreement that we signed actually incorporates that.
Incorporates no research.
No matchmaking and
Let
no
me see if I can
research.
parse this out. What I think I hear you say is that the worst, quote-unquote, worst thing is that Iran may have been researching technology.
Yeah.
And that would not even be illegal under the agreement as it stands now.
But then, that is correct. I just want to add one more thing, because since this is most of the discussion we have is hearsay, but there's a precedent, because Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the leader, the person who created the Islamic Republic, said that production, maintenance, or use of nuclear weapons are un-Islamic.
Yeah, I want to get into that for a moment because I think people tend to, we want to believe the protestations of our religious leaders in the West when they say things in matters of faith.
But there's a
when
precedent.
somebody in the Muslim world says something like this, that's not jihad,
Right.
but actually the opposite, saying, it's a religion of peace, we will never use these weapons.
Yeah.
We tend to just discard that.
And there's a precedent for that, because during the Iran-Iraq war, when the Iraqis used chemical weapons against Iran, the Iranian generals went to Khomeini and said, let's use chemical weapons against the Iraqi soldiers, and he said, you cannot use chemical weapons because it's anti-Islamic.
Well, going back to this other question of whether they have weapons or not, I mean, I don't think anybody actually believes that, very few people believe that Iran was specifically going to build a weapon within a certain specific period of time. At worst, they were going to research the technology that might allow them to do it in the future. The UN nuclear watchdog said they weren't doing it. U.S. intelligence said they weren't doing it, and I think the Israeli intelligence was also of the opinion that they were not going to actually, or they had not yet got anywhere near the possibility of building a weapon. Is this sound and fury to force this nuclear agreement, whatever it is, about something else? Is it about something besides stopping the weapon? Is it about keeping Iran in line? Is it about world politics between the Soviets and the Chinese and the West? Is there something else going on here?
It depends on what country we're talking about, because according to the information that we have, all the countries of the world, with the exception of Israel, have been basically supporting this treaty. Of course, Saudi Arabia, behind the scenes, is objecting to it, but verbally, even they're supporting it. So the question is why Israel and Saudi Arabia are against this particular agreement, because it is advantageous to them in terms of security. And again, this has been demonstrated not only by major American, officers of very high ranking, and intelligence officers of high ranking, Israeli officers of high ranking.
Why is it beneficial?
Because right now, according to estimates, Iran was between a couple of weeks or a couple of months away from having enough refined material to build a nuclear bomb. So having the material and building the bomb, of course, are totally different. With this agreement, it goes back at least to 1 year. And we haven't lost anything because...
Why is that beneficial to...
because Iran,
why is objecting to that reversal of the direction of their efforts? Why is that beneficial to, say, Israel or Saudi Arabia?
Why they're objecting? Well, there isn't... As a matter of fact, there was a reference... there were 2 articles that I read. One of them was about the book which was written by the former ambassador of Israel in the United States, who actually had a comment that maybe Ahmadinejad was better for us. And the reason is that we are talking about geopolitics. Obviously, Israel has to be concerned about its security. There has been some outrageous statements coming up from Ahmadinejad, which, by the way, I just read an article written by a Jewish journalist who came back from Iran and wrote a long, long article on the situation in Iran. And he said that even among the high-ranking clergy, there is a differentiation between Jews in Israel. And also they said our objection is not mostly to the to Israel as a country, but it's Israel's policies.
Well, I understand there's this part, okay, without getting into the headbutting there, the world wants, number one, the world wants, six major powers in the world and the United Nations seem to want this detente, this backing off of tension. If the U.S. Congress was to block this in some fashion, is there any precedent for us, United States, acting in such a unique, contrary way to the will of the rest of the world?
Well, the one that comes to mind, of course, is the League of Nations after the First World War, where we were alone because of our Congress in rejecting such an international agreement.
International group of nations, which Woodrow Wilson pushed aggressively for, and some say killed him in his effort to actually get it passed. And that League of Nations withered away. It basically just died on the vine. They continued to have offices into the 30s, I believe, maybe even today in some functions. I seem to remember something, but nobody takes it seriously, and who knows what that might have done in the shadows of World War II, I mean. So in the Congress, what's the U.S. political issue here? Why are members of Congress opposed to this other than they just don't want Obama to succeed in something?
Well, I wouldn't cast that off as insignificant.
I don't either.
I think that this Congress has shown that if Obama said, we're going to make everybody a millionaire in the United States, they would oppose it for some reason, which is a shame, because I think that is the leading reason. Secondly, Netanyahu and the conservative Israelis are against this without really, to my reading, and I'd love to hear your view on this, Farin, without offering an alternative. The alternative seems to be, oh, you could have gotten better terms. And that's
that's all.
Coulda, shoulda stuff.
They don't offer an alternative to Affordable Health Care Act. They don't offer an alternative to a whole lot of things,
right.
But they are opposed. They're against it without having to have something better.
Right.
But I think
and the pressure's hard. I mean, I happened to listen to Netanyahu speaking to Hadassah. Are you familiar with Hadassah? It's international medical assistance, so I'll leave it at that. And he addressed them, and he made it sound like it would be the end of the world if this agreement goes through. But and Hadassah ended up saying that they don't care for, I mean, the result of this discussion was a unified statement that they don't think this is the right agreement, but they do support further negotiations. They think negotiations are the way out, not force.
It is getting polarized into a religious kind of tension here. The American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee and the Republican Jewish Committee have committed to spending more than $40 million in television and radio advertising and print advertising to block this treaty. There's almost nothing coming from the other side. There's almost no money coming from the other side that would support this treaty. I can just imagine if some Iranian interest group was to put $40 million into the American political scene in order to support this treaty, all the hell that would break loose. But these religious pressures, and I think they come down to religious pressures, are in danger of influencing American policy dramatically and putting us out of sorts with the rest of the world. I think that's bizarre and scary.
Well, some of it's self-destructive too. I mean, Schumer out of New York, you probably know Schumer having been there as long as you were, typically slightly moderate but liberal senator. He's come out against this, and I think it's purely from the pressure from the Jewish lobbies. The interesting thing is, it's not just the Jewish lobbies. We don't hear about it, but the Saudis are putting a lot of pressure.
The Saudis, they do.
And they've made a statement if this treaty isn't.
This is an internal Muslim religious war.
Right. So it's multi-faceted religious issues going on here.
Well, so here's what happens. If the U.S. did not approve this, somehow blocked the implementation, the U.S. then stands alone. The rest of the world, China, Russia, Great Britain, France, Germany, all powerful economies of the world, lift sanctions, go back to dealing with Iran, which then is able to export oil and otherwise engage in commerce. What kind of world would that be? Have you thought about that?
Well, it's important to know that the arguments against the agreement are presenting two alternatives. One is to wait until we get a better deal without specifying what it is and how we are going to get it. Right. And the second one is to go to war. It's interesting for me that certain Lieberman now has been brought to the picture now in opposition to this agreement.
War, though.
Right. So if you're waiting for better deal, they argue that the reason why Iran was willing to come and negotiate was because of the sanctions we imposed on them. So,
don't you agree that is part of the pressure?
Definitely that's going to work.
But some of the sanctions are going to be lifted because the rest of the world is not going to play the American
Precisely,
game.
Because then that logic doesn't stand on its own legs, because then there is not going to be any sanction. And so what is going to happen is that Iran is going to demonstrate, first of all, it's going to increase the power of the radicals within Iran. That with the United States, we try to make a deal, but everybody else is agreeing with us, just the United States. And so therefore, it's going to enhance their position to a certain extent. It's going to, it's very easy for, even Friedman, in an article in the newspaper, in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, he argued that really when we look at other countries, we should not think that these are enemies of ours in every single respect, or they are friends of ours in every single respect. So he gives, for instance, the example of Saudi Arabia. Of the 19 hijackers, 15 were Saudis. And then they are the guys, in order to stay in power, they are providing billions of dollars to Wahhabis who are advocating the same ideology of ISIS. And then on the other side, we look at Iran. And by the way, I have to say this before I continue. I have not visited Iran for the since the revolution because I totally despise that government, and they killed one of my closest friends because I wrote a lot about.
Unfortunately, you have to vouch for your side of this, and that way the ideas should stand for themselves.
So, but I don't want to try that to tarnish, my analytical ability. So, that doesn't exist, it doesn't stand on its own legs. Already, the president of Iran has been invited to go to Germany, to France, to England. All the companies there, even McDonald's is trying to get in there with franchise. So, it basically is going to keep American companies from the Iranian market. And then also, if you look at Iran before the revolution, the closest allies of the United States. Iranians have been referred to as the people in the Middle East who likes Americans more than any other group.
Well, I think that the American public has forgotten or is not being allowed to remember or is not being told about the sophistication of the Persian Iranian country, the whole history of that culture. We're not talking about the Saudi desert. We're talking about a very sophisticated population, and I think that's been submerged intentionally, so we don't appreciate what a dynamic and intellectual and powerful society Iran has been over the centuries, and there's no reason to think that there is a certain belief system that you can't negotiate with tribal folks. These tribesmen down in Africa or the desert Arabs, you can't really, because they don't understand it. Certainly the Persians and their tradition understand how to deal fairly and honestly and intellectually with the rest of the world. And I think it's a sad thing that they're not included in the society. So let's just do another little what-a-be. If we decide that we are going to, the only thing you can do is have to be to bomb the facilities, and leaving aside the question of how effective bombing would be, we would be bombing a country that's part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that appears to be complying with with all the rules that have been written. Nobody can prove that they haven't. They're allowed to do the technology. They're allowed to accumulate a certain amount of material. And we would then risk starting a really even worse configuration in that area. At the same time, halfway around the world, we have a nation, North Korea, that has walked away from the NNP and is clearly possessing of atomic weapons in violation of that agreement.
Demonstrated, right?
And is even allegedly recently heated up that war over there again. They're starting to stir the pot. Why are we not bombing them? I mean, they have atomic weapons. Or is the fact that they have atomic weapons prove the value of having those weapons?
Yeah. Well, actually, one thing that, again, when we look into the logic of why somebody in Iran may think they have to have nuclear weapons, is that if you look at the countries that gave up their technology in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein being one, and Muammar Gaddafi being another, who actually, they boasted that agreement. You remember that this is triumph in negotiation. We forced them to give up by negotiation. What happened to those two guys?
Those are excellent points that are again lost in the American public, and nobody even thinks about it. We got Gaddafi saying to quit and surrender their technology, actually disperse it.
Right.
And now they're gone. They're history.
And then North Korea, the leaders are in power still.
Yeah, a crazy man. Gaddafi was crazy by all reports, and Sun Yunil, or whatever his name is, also crazy, but he's still in power. Yeah. And the other two are gone. Interesting. Let's talk about a thing called a nuclear-free zone. There is this kind of idea of implementing parts of the Earth that the rest of the world agrees will not hold nuclear weaponry. I think I've seen a map of it in which mostly South America and Central America and Africa are included in this. Is that by treaty? Are you familiar with this?
I'm not very familiar with the 3D controlling those minerals. I know that in terms of the agreement that we have right now with Iran, all phases of nuclear technology is going to be under scrutiny. Mm-hmm. That means from the mining to processing to every other aspect of it is going to be controlled. But in terms of mining, and I don't think that there is an agreement which is going to put those under the
No, I was just about weapons-free. I should have said nuclear weapons-free zones. The idea was to expand those zones among the countries that don't have weapons and don't want weapons, and then slowly incorporate other countries that do.
Right.
And obviously, from my point of view, the one of the countries we should include in that is Israel and Pakistan, and keep expanding that. Well, we're getting down toward the end of the program. Back in the studio, if we have that slide of the 60 days to stop a war slide, I don't know if we got that up or not, but there is a website that people might want to go to if you're interested in doing something further to help people who are concerned about this. It's a group called 60 Days, numeral 60 days to stop war, stopawar.com. It's online, and you can go onto that website and see the various organizations are combating and trying to do something to move congressional members and politics in this country to the reality of the benefit of ratification, of allowing this treaty to be in place. So I hope that anybody who's concerned about a future peaceful world will participate. Hap, what do you think the chances are that this is going to get blocked?
I think it will not get blocked. I think that it'll be a big show. I mean, remember that all the Republicans are getting lots of TV time now, and this will be furthering their TV time. And I think that they'll come around. I don't think they'll get the votes they need to block it.
Okay, I should ask you what Trump's position would be, but I think I'll move back to Dr. Nasri.
I think that they may get the 60 votes to break the filibuster, but not the 67 votes for two-thirds majority.
To override the veto.
Right.
And if they, and just to go too much, to speculate a little bit further, if it was blocked, if the U.S. blocked it, what would the rest of the world do? Do you think that would stop the other nations from ratifying the treaty they've already bargained for?
I don't think so, because Iran, according to the UN, according to IAEA, according to all the other countries, has followed the terms of the agreement during this period flawlessly. And so what kind of a precedent do we leave for negotiation? So when they sit here for months upon months negotiating,
and the number I heard was something like $250 billion of assets that are being held.
The figure is different, but I think the figure which is closer to reality is about 150, 160 billion.
Just remember that was that is their money.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're going to get it.